So welcome again to the webinar Leveraging Knowledge of Human Behavior for More Sustainable Tourism. My name is Giulia David. I'm a project manager at Avitem. I will just say a couple of words about the project and why we are organizing this webinar before giving the floor to our colleagues from Behavioral Insights Team. Next slide, please. So this is a webinar that is part of a cycle. I will tell you more later on, and is also part of a Erasmus Plus project called BeST, Behavior Smart Community for Tourism. We are three partners managing this project. Avitem is a cooperation agency based in Marseille. We have also the Behavioral Insights Team, the French team of this organization, so with Alice and Claire, who will lead this webinar today. And we also have another partner, which is Behavior Smart, that is based in Bulgaria, but works very broadly across the globe. BIT and Behavior Smart are two of the global leaders of applying behavioral sciences and behavioral insights to public policies. So we are very happy to have managed to build this project. A few words about why we decided to build a project, to develop a project about sharing knowledge on the application of behavioral insights to tourism. It's actually some years ago we've started developing this new interest for the topic of applied behavioral sciences. And we quite rapidly found out that it is a topic that is relatively few explored in the area of tourism. While if we think about the tourism sector today, we find a lot of issues and challenges that are very closely related to human behaviors. And so we found that it would be very relevant to bring together the knowledge and the practice from the behavior sciences community with also the issues and the challenges of the tourism sector. And so we decided to build a community of practice, which is a bit the core of the BeST project. A community that gathers people that are interested in the topic of applied behavioral sciences to tourism issues. And so the BeST project was born. So it was born also from the contacts that we have created with BIT and Behavior Smart, and the common interest and focus that we would like to give to the knowledge sharing. So I'm sharing this little visual with you just to highlight the key elements of our project and also the reason why we are organizing these webinars. We would like to create a sort of living knowledge base about this application of behavioral approaches to tourism, and also create awareness in the tourism sector. Many of those participating today are actors of the tourism industry or work in tourism agencies or municipalities that work on managing a destination. And so we would like to provide a space where you can have access to knowledge about this area of application of behavioral sciences, and so that you can think how you can apply this to your work. Next slide. So here I just wanted to share our expectations when we had our first meeting in Paris between the project partners, because these are expectations that I think we can share with the rest of the community. Again, as I said, we would like to create a space where we can build a higher awareness of behavioral knowledge, and also build a community of people that are interested in this topic. The community of practice that we would like to create with BeST would also be a space where we could explore new areas of research, new areas of cooperation, including through other European projects. And also a big objective of this project is to share knowledge, because as I said, we have in this partnership two organizations that have a very high level expertise on the application of behavioral sciences to policies, programs, services that are for the common good. And so we think that is a very precious occasion to make this knowledge more accessible and to share this expertise to the community of people that are interested in creating new models of tourism for tomorrow. Next slide. Thanks. So in this last slide, and then I will give the floor to BIT, but I just wanted to tease you a little bit about what comes next, because as I said, it's the first of a cycle of webinars. Today, we are going to have an introduction of the fundamentals of the behavioral approach. You will see with BIT, they will tell us more about what we will see today, but it will be the opportunity to have a broader understanding of the behavioral approach, how our brain works, and how we can use this knowledge to improve the policies that we design, and also the services and the programs. But we in the following webinars, we are also diving into more detail into how we can apply this to the tourism specific challenges and issues of today and tomorrow. And also we will dive into some more practical elements on how to make it right, how to do it right. And so this slide gives you an overview of the 4 webinars. The next webinar is the date is already fixed. It's the 17th of November. So you have the QR code here to subscribe, and we can also share it in the chat during the meeting, the webinar. One last thing before to give the floor to Claire and Alice. If you would like to ask questions, you have the question and answer button in Zoom, so you can use this. And I think I've said everything. I will so leave the floor to Alice Escand and Claire Dale for this first webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And hi, everyone. It's really weird because I don't see any of you, but I hear that you're many. So I'm Alice Escand, Senior Advisor at BIT France office, and I'm here with my colleague, also Senior Advisor at the French office. So in today's webinar, we're going to brush the surface of a very large and big topic, which is behavior science and the applied aspects of the behavior approach. We'll give you in the series of webinar a bit more info and details on the methodology, etc. But here the idea is really to raise the awareness and tell you a little bit about what we mean when we need a behavioral approach to tourism. So we'll start with the fundamentals of the behavior approach, and we'll talk a little bit about the theory that's behind the work, some of the work that we do. Then, knowing what we know about human behavior, we'll look at how we can integrate that knowledge into building better policy, programs, or services. And then we'll end up with giving you a bit of a teaser and a lot of examples of how we could apply this approach to sustainable tourism. As Julia said, it's the first of a series of webinars, and in the next one, we'll approach much more the methodological kind of approach to behavioral approach. So before we dive into the content, we try to make this a little bit interactive. So we're going to try to use a piece of technology. So this is called Slido. So you can access it either at typing slido.com on your computer or on a phone, or I think you can type slide.do. I think that works as well. And then when you get there, they'll ask you a code and you can type the code that's on the slide. So if you don't see it, it's 1396596. So I'll just give everyone 1 minute to join that poll, 1396596. So one of the first things we want to ask you is, without us telling you anything about this, what do you know about behavior science? What does behavior approach mean to you? Does it mean anything to you? Do you have some ideas and conceptions, but not everything that's very clear? just let us know and we'll wait for a few answers before we show you. So I think we have 3 participants, 6. Oh, we're very nervous that no one log in. So please participate. If that's also technically difficult for some reasons, feel free to just write your answers on the chat. Okay, we'll just wait maybe 1 more minute. If you click, then that's the answers. I think so. Okay, maybe we can look at reveal. Yeah, big reveal.
Okay.
Okay, so ignoring the big mass of numbers at the middle, we have a lot of different answers. So of course, this is a French and English webinar, so we have a few in French and in English. So I can read nudges, which is not surprising. That's probably the most popular word that comes when we think about behavior science, and we'll touch a little bit about nudge and whether is that the whole discipline or is it part of the discipline. We have comprendre les comportements humains, understanding human behavior, and behavior analysis, analyse des comportements, very good, human brain, biais cognitif. That's also a big one with nudge that we have. We have inconscient, which is a really interesting answer because behavior science does touch on conscious and unconscious processes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. What else do we have that's interesting? Neuroscience, psychology. Yeah, so a few disciplines that pop up that are part of this big umbrella that we call behavior science. And one that I like, application des théories à la réalité, and probably a sub there, which is how do you actually take that theory that we have from the human brain, from psychology, from neuroscience, and how do you apply it to a real world setting?
And it doesn't mean anything, which will be helpful for you to tell us what it does mean.
It doesn't mean anything to some people. Great, we're here to tell you. All right, so maybe moving on, we'll continue a little bit with the interactiveness, and then I promise after that we'll stop bothering you. So if you stay on that Slido, we're going to do an exercise all together just to demonstrate, because showing is better than telling. So that first exercise, if you can show it, thanks. We're going to show you a list of words that's on the slides. I'm going to read them out to you, and you'll have 20 seconds to memorize them. So I'm going to read out the words to you, and then without marking them anywhere, please don't cheat. Don't mark them. Try to remember as many words as you can. So you have bed, lit, rest, repos, awake, éveillé, tired, fatigué. You don't have to memorize in both languages. You can choose. Dream, rêve, wake, réveillé, snooze, roupillon, blanket, couverture, doze, dormir, slumber, pioncer, snore, ronfler, nap, sieste, peace, calme, yawn, bâillement, drowsy, somnolent. Probably took me 30 seconds to read them out, so I'll just give you 10 more seconds to try to memorize those words. Okay, maybe if you can move on. All right, so you've tried to remember those words. So now in the Slido that you have, can you please write down some of the words that you remember from that list? Do you remember the word snore, ronfler? Do you remember the word wake, réveiller? Do you remember the word sleep, sommeil? Do you remember the word blanket, sorry, couverture, or nap, sieste? So please write your answers if you remember any of these words from the list.
20 people.
Okay. Maybe we can, it's just, I don't have any way of asking people if they're done, but all right, let's see the answer. So Oh, it's changing. So 91% of you have remembered the word naps, yes. 83% the word snore, and blankets. 74% of you the word wake, and 43% the word sleep. So if you move on. So that's really interesting because all of the words that we presented to you were on that list except the word sleep. So if you just look at the slide over here, there's no sleep. If you can move on, thank you. So if you were the one that actually chose sleep, and I can't name you because I don't see any of you, but you shouldn't feel bad at all because you're in good company and you're not the only one. In a study that was done, about half of the people in the room will falsely recall the word sleep when they get to shown this list. So what happened here is that your brain has done something quite smart, actually. It spotted a pattern. It did some pattern recognition. A pattern is basically this group of words that all have something in common. And then from that, it's fill in the blanks. And the blanks here was sleep. So our brains are wired to do this all the time, recognizing some patterns and then fill in the blank. That's kind of how we manage the big amount of information that's thrown at us every day. Basically, this is a shortcut to be able to optimize our performance. And it's kind of these predictable mental shortcuts like this that are at the heart of behavioral science. And I'll be talking about that in a lot more detail, about 5 minutes. And I know Claire will also give you some example of shortcuts that exist in the tourism industry. So this was kind of a cute example of how sometimes memory is affected by context. But actually, this can have also real world consequences and sometimes even life-changing implication. So this is an example that we've taken. It's actually in the UK, where we know that false recall due to false memory can lead to mistaken eyewitness identification, which are the leading factor in wrongful convictions. So it's estimated that 70% of false convictions in the UK are caused by an inaccurate eyewitness statement, meaning that people think that they remember something, but actually they didn't. So I think this association calculated that up to 100 innocent people could be wrongfully convicted each year because of these false eyewitness. And what's even more remarkable is that eyewitness testimony is still the main form of evidence in more than 20% of cases. So in that case, pattern recognition and false pattern recognition can have real world consequences. It's not only memory that's affected by the context, but also our judgment. So this is another example in India, where we know that crossing train tracks by foot is a quite routine excess, and it's casualties from crossing tracks by foot are actually really high. And we know people are really bad at judging speed and distance, including drivers. Mm-hmm. So yellow lines were painted at regular intervals on the track to give the driver some reference points and to bring something quite unfamiliar to the environment that will make the driver slow down. So that little intervention itself reduced the number of people hit by trains by 75%. So you may have heard of a similar example actually with cars and like drawing lines to slow down traffics in dangerous turns. So it's not simply actually our memory or judgment that's influenced by context. In fact, most of the decisions are influenced by a variety of internal and external factors. Some we're conscious of and some we're not always conscious of. So when we talk about internal factors, that can be the mood I'm in today, if I'm hungry or not, if I've eaten or not, if I'm tired. There's actually lots of study that shows that these factors can affect decisions, sometimes in very important ways. When we talk about external factors, that can be anything from what I see around me, what I see other people around me doing, to what kind of information I see, but most importantly, how it's presented, like in the case of sleep. And that's what we're going to call environmental and contextual effects. And the thing is that the impact of these effects on our decisions are usually stronger than what most people expect. So we can sometimes have this impression that, we always make the best decision for ourselves. We weigh the pros, the cons, we integrate all the relevant information into our decision, where in fact, our mind is a bit less independent than we imagine. And the reason for that is partly due to how our brain functions. So why do environmental and contextual factors have such an impact on our behavior? So you have to know that there's actually tons and tons of literatures and theories which attempt to explain human behaviors. We find that one is particularly useful for our work, and that can explain a lot of these mental shortcuts that we just showed you. This theory is called dual processing theory. So the dual processing theory, sorry, I need to apparently speak slower. I know I speak very fast. Dual processing theory is a work of Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman and his research partner Amos Tversky. So Kahneman's work divides the brain into two systems for how we process information and how we make decisions. And humans in any moment of decisions are operating in one of the two systems. So we have the first system, system 1, that's a fast automatic system. We have system 2, that's a slow reflective system. System 1, the automatic system, operates automatically, quickly, with little to no effort and no sense of voluntary control. So for example, if I ask you 2 times 2, I can't hear the answer, but I assume that you'll tell me 4. But also if I tell you, don't think about 2 times 2, you also probably will think about 4. So this is the system that you use when you do this very, very quick association in your brain, but that's also the mode that you'll use when, for example, you're in autopilot mode. So for example, when you're going to work in a route that you've done 100 times and you know by heart. System 2, on the other hand, is known as the effortful system. So it's drawn on when we do something that doesn't come naturally and requires some sort of effort. So that's a system, for example, that enables us to learn how to drive a car. When you've learned how to drive a car and feel comfortable with it, then you can, transition to system 1 and then drive without thinking. But in the initial stage of learning how to do something or thinking about something in a very deliberate and analytical way, that's system 2 that you're mobilizing. So we think that system 2 is the one that operates in our life most of the time, but actually it turns out that most of our lives are spent operating on system 1, at least a big amount. And I'll talk about it a bit more later, but in policy also, sometimes we think of that system, people are operating in system 2 in society, but actually we can see that system 1 can come and play. So why do we have these two systems? And sometimes I think this is quite important because we tend to think, okay, system 1 is the one that's responsible for some of the biases, some of the shortcuts, some of the errors, and that's an inefficient system. But that's not exactly true. So there is a sort of division of labor that exists between system 1 and system 2, and that's made to be highly efficient and minimize efforts while optimizing performance. So in this division of labor, system 1 is giving as much of the work as possible. It acts as a kind of cognitive autopilot that's going to replace the complex decision-making with simple heuristics. So heuristics are rules of thumb. So basically, I will do, what's the easiest thing for me, or I only attend to something if it's urgent, or I watch how other acts. So this will make these shortcuts basically to instead of complex decision. This is a big advantage from an evolutionary perspective, because if we didn't do that, then we would have to overthink every decision, and this would basically burn all of our mental capacity. So system 2 is really deployed when we need to learn new things. It helps us exercise self-control, to make calculated decisions by evaluating our options, weighing pros and cons of each options. It can help us in certain decisions that we have to do, but when we don't need to mobilize it, we'll rely on system 1 thinking. So both systems have huge benefits, but obviously they also have limitations. So this limitation of system 1 is that the heuristics that we use to guide us in most of our life, like any kind of simplified rule, can sometimes lead to mistakes or to suboptimal outcomes. And system one can trip us in sometimes predictable ways. So this is these systematic errors that we will do in our decision making. That's what we called cognitive biases. And I've seen that you've put the name in the poll at the beginning. And this is indeed a big theoretical base for behavior science. So I'm sure you've heard of some cognitive biases. Just to give you one as an example, we sometimes talk about confirmation bias. That's when we're going to favor information that confirms what we already know. For example, when we look online and only look for confirming information. So that's a cognitive bias that stems from our system one that's looking for the shortcuts. So there are obviously limitations of a system two as well, but the main limitation is that we don't have sufficient mental processing power to make all our decisions based on system two. We have a limited amount of cognitive bandwidth that we can use only on certain decisions. So if we move on, I don't know if there are questions. I can stop for 5 minutes to answer some questions about this. Okay, no questions. I will continue. So you might tell me, okay, this is interesting. I understand kind of the basis of system one, system two, but what does it have to do with making policies, meta services? How do I apply this to make more efficient policy programs or services? So basically, most public policy, and we can apply this in policy in general, tourism policies, services, programs, that applies to all of these domains, is very reliant on the idea that people will use their system two when they make the decisions, that evaluate the options, and they will always behave in line with what they want, or the options that they expect will result in the greatest value from themselves. So in reality, we know that people often use system one for many decisions because they have limited time or they have limited information, and their decisions are based on automatic reaction. So this is some example of some domains of public policy, but we extend this to tourism. This is voting and saving and recycling, sorry. And so we assume if we give people the right kind of information, that saving is good for you, that you should recycle, then people will take the decision that's in line with their intention. In the heart of the work of the behavioral approach is in the common thread of this, is taking people as they actually are, rather than how we would like them to be. And we work with the kind of our ingrained cognitive or behavioral tendencies rather than against them, to actually augment the impacts of these policies. So we try to develop or refine policies and systems with a better understanding of how system one and system two will influence decision-making in a given situation. We don't just assume that we use a system two, we also add the system one in the design of these policy, programs, or services. So this is a picture that we like to show to kind of illustrate this thinking. So if you see, I want to basically design my policy, my programs in a very nice kind of perpendicular shape, but people will actually take the shortcuts. And this is kind of these mental shortcuts that we were telling you about. We have to get rid of the mentality of, if we build something, people will come. Mm-hmm. If you build something the wrong way, they'll take the shortcuts. So designing for system one can actually lead to big impacts and big successes. One example of this is a project that BIT worked on in the UK in the automatic enrollment in pensions. So in 2012, before the project, we had less than half of the UK employees that had an active workplace pension scheme. So at this time, not signing up for a pension was the default, meaning that's what happened if you did nothing, you weren't placed in any kind of pension scheme. And behavior insights, like all these different mental shortcuts, show us that we have a tendency to stick to the pre-selected default. If something had been pre-selected for me, then I'll probably stick with it. This is why when you get a new phone, you most likely will not go through each individual settings and make change. You will stick to the majority of defaults that you maker provides you with. So we changed the defaults and we made an auto enrollment the default for all the UK employees. And the percentage of people enrolled in the pension plan went from 47% to 76%. Just to make sure we didn't remove the choice. The choice was still there to opt out, but we changed the default of the preset setting. So if we were looking at just normal economic theory, this would not make sense, and that shouldn't work, right? Because it only takes about an hour to choose a pension, and it affects the rest of your life. So if we think that we are operating on system 2, we shouldn't be always taking the time to make that decision. And that the way that the decision is presented shouldn't matter. But in reality, it does. Even though we all want to spend time thinking about our pension, signing up for a pension, we don't get around to do it. And there are tons of other examples where we do that. We know we should be doing something, but we don't get the time to do it. So that's the kind of power of making things easy and designing policy to account for system 1. And I think they've done some calculation, and now in the UK, more than 10 million people make additional savings of around 20 billion pounds each year. And that also explains or illustrates rather a concept that I like, that behavior science is not always just changing individuals. It's actually really hard to change individuals. It's about making the change easy. And here is making the change or of a positive decision the easiest thing to do. So before we go on to talking a bit more about tourism, there's kind of 2 words of cautions that I want to talk about. The first thing is that I don't want people to take away from the session, and sometimes what they take away from behavior science is, okay, behavior science is about a list of biases and a list of nudge interventions that can counter these biases. So now I know the approach and I can go and apply this nudge here and this nudge there. It's actually not that simple. Behavioral approach is very much of a method and a practice that's based on science and evidence. So it's based on 3 key principles. The first is evidence about behavior. So we focus on both types of evidence. On the theoretical evidence, so we take the best of the research, whether that's dual process theory, which I mentioned earlier with system 1 and system 2, or other insights that we get from disciplines as psychology, behavioral economics, etc. But we also validate the theory with the field, with the empirical research evidence. So we go in the field, we ask people, and we validate our theories. So theory is great, but life is always a bit messier than that. So the second principle is the practical and pragmatic application of this knowledge and this practice to develop intervention and services that worked well. And for that, we work with the constraint that we have. And the third one is because we know that behavior is complex and we cannot be certain that an intervention will work, wherever is possible, there's a big focus on evaluating and testing through experimentation, randomized controlled trials, or other types of evaluations, whether an intervention or a nudge or any kind of behavioral informed intervention worked or not. And it's also these evaluations that in turn will increase our understanding of what drives human behaviors and what are effective ways for promoting positive behavior change. The second word of caution that I wanted to talk about is around the debate that we often have in what is the role of behavior science intervention compared to the most traditional tools of policymaking. So this is a point to make very clear that behavioral approach, they complement, but don't replace traditional tools of policy or program making. So the traditional tools and levers that we are talking about here to influence behaviors are typically either regulation, so the ability to compel people to do something, incentive, so the ability to incentivize or disincentivize citizens to do something, and third, information, so providing information via campaigns or regular types of information. So to be clear, those are extremely necessary. But behavior insights can complement, behavior insights or behavior approach can complement and augment the impact on those by either informing how a certain regulation, how a certain incentive, or how information should be designed and should be delivered in line with what we know of the behavior, or to propose different intervention that can perhaps try to unlock things if we see that sometimes we've tried regulation, we've tried incentive, we've tried information, and those are not enough to shift a behavior. So I don't know if you have any questions on this section before we move on to the more applied tourism part. We can also take them at the end. Okay. Sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alice. Can everyone hear me? Julia, can you give me a thumbs up if yeah? Perfect. So thanks so much, Alice, for this very rapid introduction to kind of the fundamentals of what we do as a behavioral approach. Very much in a mirror structure to what Julia was saying at the start in terms of the articulation of this series of webinars. We're going to move from the more theoretical to the more applied. And so this next section is going to be about giving you a little bit of an introduction to how we can apply all those things that Alice was talking about, specifically to the area that you as practitioners will be interested in, to tourism and hopefully more sustainable tourism. Very much a teaser kind of section. Again, we're going to brush across the surface of the fundamentals of the theory of this behavioral approach. And we're going to talk about a few case studies to give you some inklings of things that have worked elsewhere to influence behavior. Again, to reiterate Alice's wise words of caution, there are examples of things that have worked somewhere, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but not to say they're universal answers to how to change behavior.
I was told that we have to speak slower for the interpreter.
I was trying to speak slowly, so this is going to be a challenge. Okay.
I think that's a strong suit.
No. Okay. Well, Julia, you can give me hands down, up, middle to let me know if I'm speaking too quickly. But so if we try to turn to applying kind of these theoretical insights to tourism specifically, what does that mean? What does that mean in practice? And really, it's about trying to understand how tourists really think and make decisions. Very much, again, mirroring what Alice was saying about taking into account all the different ways that our brains work so that we understand how tourists really function as opposed to how we would want them to. And to design our services, our programs, the way we manage destinations, the way we manage travel according to how people actually work. Is that any better in terms of speed? Okay. So again, turning to those two systems, as Alice was saying, it's one way of conceptualizing how the brain works. It's quite a helpful one, we find, and applied to tourism, it gives us some insights into how we can take those mental shortcuts that Alice was mentioning into account. But really we have, again, this kind of slow, reflective, rational system that Alice was mentioning that is all going to be about, the information I can give tourists, the incentives that they can have, financial and otherwise, rules and regulations, all the set of factors that a tourist who is using that system can take into account to shift and shape decisions on what to do, where to go, and so on. And then there's this system one that we've talked about that is more intuitive and will be shaped and rely a lot more on the power of defaults. We'll talk about that in a more kind of applied manner in a minute, but going back to Alice's example, emotions, what others do around me, what I know and think that others are doing, so social influence, and then a range of different biases, those shortcuts that Alice was mentioning that impact the way that we think, the way that we make decisions. Just to give you a few examples, I think a lot of us will be familiar with some of those shortcuts that we can take. But when we think specifically about traveling tourist behavior, one of the biases that we can think of is one that we call choice overload. Very much the idea that, too many things to think about, too many things to see. I will just follow TripAdvisor. Again, following the easiest way of getting out of this mental overload that is represented by just too many choices at any one time. A second one is around hassle factors, any kind of difficulty, big or small, and actually a lot of the research that we know shows the impact and the disproportionate impact of small hassles, small difficulties, small obstacles on our decision-making. And any kind of difficulty, big or small, and I would stress again that small difficulty should not be overlooked, will have an impact on the way we make our decisions and specifically how that system one kind of jumps to conclusions. For example, I don't want to walk too much hassle. Let's just go to the easiest option. Why don't I just go to this panini shop right next to the place, as opposed to thinking through what the other options are if there's something that's more beneficial for me to do elsewhere. Not to say that paninis aren't great.
That was an example from the Florence work we did in Italy, in case we need to replace the context of the panini shop.
Yeah, okay. I'm getting more hand signs that I'm speaking quickly. Let me know, Julia. I get excited about the content, so let me know. Another thing is around self-control. I don't know about you, but when we were preparing for this, I could really relate to this one example. You know, you're here for a few days. For a lot of us, traveling will be a matter of days, not, you know, months and so on. And so thinking, it's a holiday after all, I don't really need to care about sustainability. Let me have, you know, a bit of a break. It's definitely something that I think kind of impacts our decision-making. In the sphere of sustainable tourism as well, it's helpful to think a bit of this issue of self-control, also in the fact that, you know, a lot of us travel somewhere that is far away from us where we usually are. And so the consequences of our actions when we are at that destination feel very remote. And I'm not going to be there anymore to witness, you know, the consequences of what I've done or what I've contributed to locally. And so very easy to kind of put that to one side and let yourself kind of enjoy, do the things that you know, intuitively want to do without weighing the pros and cons of that decision. Again, you know, I'm only here for a few days. Let's enjoy. Let's not think about the consequences of all this. Very easy to, you know, shield yourself from that. And again, one of the shortcuts that your system one will take so that you don't have to weigh the pros and cons. You don't have to think about the consequences of what you're doing. Okay, so that's all good and well. It's great to know that we take shortcuts, that we're not perfectly rational individuals. What do we do about it now? How do we take that into account? And so luckily, there's more and more research coming out, and there's already a growing body of evidence around all the different things that do impact our decision-making, all the different biases that Alice mentioned, all the different shortcuts that our brains will take. And so we can practice designing for predictably irrational people. That means taking into account both systems and thinking of how both of them need to be addressed and taken into account in the travel environment that we're offering, in the information that we're giving, in the way that we're trying to kind of shape and influence tourism and decisions within it. So for example, turning to kind of the system two, make, you know, the information, the educational, the informational material that you have more innovative, more effective, make it more appealing, make it easier to draw people's attention and make them want to read the information, process it, reflect on it, make it easier and more interesting for them to activate that more effortful system two. And in the same way, don't discount the impact of system one. We've really focused both in Alice's presentation and in that short list of examples that I just gave you on all the ways that the system one might kind of influence your decision-making. Draw on it, you know, as a tourism practitioner, make sure that you take it into account. Look for opportunities in the context, in the environment, to make the target behavior, what it is that you would like the tourist to display, the more natural and desirable thing to do. I'm not going to give you tons of examples here because in just a minute, we're going to go into practical examples of what does that mean, kind of designing for both those systems. Before we do that, I'm just going to turn to what kind of tourism challenges a behavioral approach is most useful to. As Alice kind of pointed out, the behavioral sciences are all about trying to understand, examine, and hopefully see how we can affect like individual decisions, but also making them easier and so on. So the example Alice gave was about, making that option just as easy as possible. So changing the structure around individual behavior. And so if we think of it like that, how can we, what does the behavioral toolkit give us to examine and hopefully influence tourist decisions? Well, one way we thought about it, and this is by no means the only way to think about it, and actually in the Q&A section at the end of this, we'd love to have people's reactions on where do you see the behavioral approach as being most useful? Does it fall within those categories on the slide? Does it not? What do you think about this? But one way of very simplistically summarizing where we think the behavioral approach can help is around, in the first instance, how do individuals travel? Their very physical means of transport, mobility, kind of decisions on how we go about traveling. In a second instance, when people get to the destination, where do they go? Which sites do they visit? Which ones do they prefer to visit, and so on, which will have obviously very real implications for kind of flow and like tourism flow management. And then in the last instance, we've kind of regrouped it in this very large and broad category, but things around what do I do once I'm at that tourism destination that I'm at? What activities do I undertake and how do I do them? So things around, do I go hiking? Do I do kind of more sustainable tourism activities? And then how do I do them? Do I kind of litter when I'm there? Do I take things from the natural environment that I shouldn't be taking? Or do I do it in a way that is kind of having the minimum, I don't want to say no impact, but having like the smallest impact possible on the natural environment or on local populations, or just I'm kind of at the local site that I'm visiting. What do I eat? What choices do I make? Just everything around what do I do and how do I do it once I've reached my destination. I'm going to pause here in case there are a few questions, I don't know, in the chat or anything that we want to address.
There's a question about ethics, and I'd love if we can talk about it, but maybe after the presentation.
Great. It won't be long before we can turn to that debate, I promise. This kind of last section is going to be about giving you a few short case studies around things that have worked around the world to shape and influence behaviors. Again, to reiterate Alice's word of caution, this is not to say that they're magic recipes and that they would work everywhere in the same context, in different contexts rather, sorry, in the same way or anything. You need to always be kind of mindful of the local context, the local environment that the behavior you're trying to understand is anchored in, and the people also that you're looking into. And we will be, throughout this series of webinars, giving you more information about that, turning to more detailed case studies, but also kind of looking at, that's all good and well, but how do we methodologically do that? And so just trying to get you excited about the next ones. But so if we look at those examples quickly, not too quickly, the system one, this example is of designing to take into account that system one that we were talking about. And it's a very simple example of when the environment was changed to try and influence, that where do I go? How do I go about it? So this picture was taken in Melbourne with a staircase that is in a station where about 800,000 people commute through every day. And the idea was to try and get people to use the stairs a lot more at the station than the escalators, the lifts, the other kind of means that they had of commuting across, with very much the idea of, trying to get people to move more. And actually just making the stairs kind of stand out, make them arguably pretty, make them kind of stand out from the rest of the environment, meant that they were noticeable, that people could see them, that when they were in that automatic commuting mode that Alice touched on earlier, where they presumably have been through that station at 800,000 times, that they've always taken the lifts, always taken the escalators, that they could notice this element in the environment again, that it could stand out as an option for them to use. Especially in a world where a lot of us have goals of moving more, but find it really difficult to maybe take small actions on a daily basis to make that happen. And so just doing that small change actually meant that 25% more people used the stairs than they used to during peak times. And that went up to 140% more during the rest of the day. Just showing how kind of a small change can have a real effect on people's behaviors. I have been told that they have repainted this now, so don't please fly all the way to Melbourne to go and see the stairs. But I don't know if those kind of initiatives have been evaluated in the same kind of robust way elsewhere. But I know, for example, that in a few cities in China, there's been a few efforts at making staircases interactive piano keyboards, which sounds loud, but apparently has also been used to try and get people to move around more in public spaces.
Yeah, just because there's a question on that, on the long-term effect of the stairs, and could be a novelty effect. I think that's definitely an hypothesis, and maybe that's why they repainted it again. I think this, in the same way that we presented that example with the tracks in India with the line, one of the mechanisms is just also to get people move from system 1 to system 2. So maybe you're driving mindlessly and suddenly you see something very bright on the road, and then you're going to pay attention, and then you're going to slow down. And sometimes with these kind of intervention, that's also the effect that we're looking for. Like maybe you would just take the elevators and don't think about it, and suddenly you see something so impressive or just novel, and that kind of draws you towards that. So could definitely be an effect, a mechanism at least.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Looking at another way that is, again, around those mechanisms of making it easy for you to switch again from system 1 to system 2 and weigh those options and think about things rationally rather than being in that autopilot mode that we can be. We have, again, our Australian team actually worked again in Australia to try and see if with the Department of Transport in Western Australia, whether they could encourage people to try public transport just once. There's a few theories obviously around what makes people change kind of their mobility and change their commuting habits, and don't want to ruin the literature review for you, but it's surprisingly hard actually to do. But the idea around this experiment was that it was trying to help people overcome some of the existing prejudice they might have around public transport by convincing them to actually give it a go just once. And so it was an experiment that was done aiming at retail staff at quite a large shopping centre in a city in Australia, in Perth, that were all staff that were commuting to the shopping centre with their car and trying to get them to shift to public transport. The experiment was with 134 staff at the shopping centre. And what happened is that they were given a free Smart Rider card, which is the local public transport card. And they were sent a few emails, like behaviorally informed emails, trying to get them to use a loaded card that had $25 worth of value on it. So they got emails every week that kind of had different messages in them to remind them that they could travel for free using the card, and that they should try and use the cards if they hadn't already. And what's interesting is that, and again, happy to take questions on this afterwards, but what's interesting is that the free card with the funding on it, the email reminders, all increase kind of public transport use above normal. And when I mean all together, increase public transport use above normal. So you have here on the screen the kind of jump that it represented in terms of public transport use between the baseline before the experiment and the intervention period, going down after the intervention period, but remaining still for the 2 months where it was measured above the baseline in terms of people giving it a go. I'm going to anticipate the same question that was asked around the stairs, because it's a very valid one. But we don't know beyond the 2 months where measures were taken of people's declared use of public transport, if or how long the behavior remained in place after the end of it. But what's interesting is that this shows that, people are more likely to use public transport if they get subsidies to do it. And at the very best, it shows, that when you get them kind of a foot in the door, when you get to convince people to try it once, that might give themselves the opportunity to realize that it can be better than driving to work in the long run. Okay, we'll take kind of questions on the experiments at the end if you want. Thinking about that other system that we have now, system 2, the more kind of rational one that makes decisions, weighs the pros and cons and so on. There's also a bunch of things that we can do to impact and affect that aspect of our decision-making process. One of them I think you'll be quite familiar with is the Google Maps system that shows you how many kind of the density of visitors at any given site, and in particular kind of main tourist attractions and so on, depending on the time of visit. And so that's just one of the tools in which you can get given information, and information that is given in an easy to understand, convenient way. You just have to look at your phone, type in where you want to go, and you get given that kind of accurate information that's easy to understand and so on, and might very well be kind of the decisive element that helps you to decide, oh, well, I might not go to the Louvre now, or I might not go between, at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday because it's really, really busy then. And so just trying to think about how, in the previous examples, we can facilitate that switch between system 1 and system 2, but then also how we can make the available information, all of the different tools that I have at my disposal to make that rational, evidence-based kind of weighed decision as kind of easy and attractive as possible. Still slower. Okay, working on it. Okay, one last example, which is probably not going to be very understandable, but I will tell you about what you need to know about this example. But this is an example of a comic that was used to try and raise awareness and convince people in China to move away from using elephant skin, which is kind of an element of traditional medicine for stomach ailments. It's not obviously directly a tourism example, but I'm keen to highlight kind of wildlife conservation initiatives and how behavioral science can help shift also behavior in that space, which hopefully is relevant in the context of tourism as well. So in this example, our team worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society in China and a local university, Sun Yat-sen University, to apply behavioral insights to try and disrupt kind of illegal wildlife trade, as I was saying. And so the idea was to kind of understand why people turn to that medicine and then design an intervention that addressed the real kind of barriers to moving away from, illegal wildlife trade-based medicine. And so what came up in the research that our team led was that people tend to know that the cures come from endangered species, but that didn't really stop them from sometimes relying on that medicine. And what was at play was that they remained still kind of heavily influenced by those around them who would, encourage them or tell them how beneficial it was to use that medicine. So for example, kind of family elders who themselves would have relied on that kind of medicine would come up as, a strong factor influencing choices to still rely on elephant skin. And so our team ran a lab in field experiment, which means that there was both kind of a controlled lab environment aspect of our experiment, but there was also kind of an in the field, very much similar to the examples that were noted earlier, aspect of it as well, with over 1,600 residents in Yunnan province in southern China, to find out if, behaviorally informed communications could influence people's intention to purchase or consume those products. Again, with the idea that, you need to understand what actually pushes people to still kind of go for that specific thing and understand what all the kind of different factors are at play, and then design a communication, or well, in this instance, it was a communication, but design an intervention that addresses those kind of different factors and addresses them in a way that will be as helpful as possible for people to engage with. And so here there was a pre-pilot phase of the research during which it was identified that kind of a comic form of communication was well identified, was kind of appreciated, turned to by the target population that we were trying to convince. And then also kind of running those kind of pre-experiments and so on, identified that some of the levers, some of the arguments that were kind of more likely to convince people to switch away from that behavior were around kind of law enforcement, and that kind of the police officer and what they represent was like an effective messenger to kind of carry that communication and message to try and shift behavior. So without kind of going into what this comic exactly says, I think you'll get from the drawings that it's a police officer saying that if you buy a little bit of skin, it's still an offense. You risk kind of serious charges for doing this. And actually, there are some like real alternatives that you can draw on from like reputable doctors and kind of the clinics and someone who will give you medicine that isn't illegal wildlife, which could be dangerous for you in that it's a criminal offense. And what was really interesting in that is that our team, and there's a whole article on this as well that I can kind of refer people to if they want more information, but participants who were shown this comic were significantly less likely to report an intention to seek out kind of that skin traditional medicine for a family member. So we were asking them if they would do it for a family member, which is a bit different than trying to get them to say, would they do it for themselves, and trying to unpack that, as compared to a group that didn't get kind of any of that information, and compared to a group that got information from in a different way as well.
Yeah, I don't know if maybe before we wrap up, this is the time to pause and take more generalist questions. We really apologize in advance. Well, apologize for speaking too fast for the interpreter, but ironically, we speak very good French, so we can take your questions in English or in French if you want, or if there's anything that you would like us to re-clarify, that's the moment. So please don't hesitate. You can, ask your questions. Don't let us feel too alone here. We want to interact with you. Maybe I can, while maybe you're thinking about some questions, I can take the question of manipulation. And please add to it if you want to. So just the question is, selon la manière dont les sciences comportementales sont utilisées, cela ne pourrait-il pas s'apparenter de la manipulation? So it's a question we get a lot. Is behavior science manipulation? So it's I'm just going to ask to say, like, it's quite a legitimate question, and I think it's just take it away from manipulation, but just to talk about generally the ethics of this field is something that we take very seriously, and that's some of the questions that we have to keep asking ourselves. That being said, so if you consider behavioral approaches, behavior science as this kind of what really it is, it's the realistic understanding of how people behave. That kind of psychological and behavioral understanding. In that view of like that being a tool in the toolbox, that's also something that you have to decide how to use, and you can use it well, you can use it less well. When you use it on the project, there's a few things that you have to consider, and these are some of the factors that, for example, when we start a project, we'll start to think about these things.
Yeah.
So one of the buckets of these things to think about is that kind of choice and transparency. So how transparent is your intervention, and how much the mechanism of your intervention are known to the public. This is not an easy question, because sometimes an intervention only works when the mechanisms are not shown, but we try to the best to kind of be transparent about the intervention that we're having. The other is this element of choice. In some of these interventions, you'll see that there's always a choice that is left for the person, and that's not something that we try to restrict the choice in. So that's more on the kind of how transparent my intervention is and my intentions are. And then the second is more on the how kind of like consensual the issue I'm working on is, right? I think we can all agree that we want to reduce obesity or non-communicable disease, or that we want to reduce the amount of car crash in the road. If you're not, tell me, but I think these are some of the topics where they are already a kind of like, they are quite consensual topics, and those are usually the types of topics that we try to work on. And so these kind of two elements, and there are more criteria. You can find some other kind of much more sophisticated thinking about these ethical things, but you have to juggle these different things when you use behavior science, and it's but it's something that we're very aware of. And the last thing I'm just going to answer is that it's also, there are no neutral choices. So things are already in a certain place in the environment, and thinking that that was a neutral choice and then it's been manipulated to look a certain way, in a way is probably also a bit naive, because the way information is presented, if there's one thing that we try to say, is that the way information is presented has an impact. So whether you think about it or not, that's not going to change the fact that it will have an impact. So I don't know if you want to add anything.
I mean, I think that was kind of very, very complete. And just in the sense to reiterate the key point, I think that it's a tool in the toolkit. And as you say, as long as we kind of have all those checks and balances, and we make sure that we tick all the boxes and so on, that we know that it's not going to disadvantage a group, or that it's going to be kind of ethical on other grounds. And I think the examples that you gave in terms of the goals that policies, that behavioral science can be used against, then I think we need just to see it as a tool. It means that if we all share that objective of, for example, reducing kind of illegal wildlife trade, the outcomes are, the choices are, I can write a communication that isn't informed by all those things that I found out from the research about what matters to people, what affects their behavior, or I can do something that will be more likely to affect the behavior. And so I think we just need to kind of think of it like that as a tool.
Right. I'm reading another question on the theoretical framework. So I'm not sure what you mean by theoretical framework, but if you mean kind of our methodological approach, as BIT, but this is not a BeST project, as BIT, we've developed our own kind of methodological framework, but that overlaps with a lot of frameworks that you can see out there, actually. But that's something it's a test methodology that we'll talk about more. In terms of like Eastern Mindspace. So I think it's quite funny, the role of the theoretical framework to think about behaviors. We presented one today, which is the dual processing theory. There are lots more that we use commonly. So for those who are maybe more into the field, we use COMBI, we use a lot of these frameworks that gives you guidelines. But I think the maturity of this field is also to know when to rely on the framework or the model and when to get away from it. Because a model is a model and it's reductory in kind of principle. And what I was saying about the core of our approach is also still empirical research that still holds true. That means that we use these frameworks and we pick on a bunch of those, and they exist, a lot of them, to help us have a more fine analysis of what we see on the ground, but it still means that we have to go on the ground. But there's no, let's say, a one size fits all, we put East to design our intervention. That wouldn't be, we don't really like these kind of approaches. So we use them as resources, but we always adapt to the context and what we see emerging. I don't know if you want to take the other one.
Yeah, I'm trying to read that. It's the same behavior to make us buy the product. Oh, that's a really interesting question. And it goes back to that point we were talking about in terms of kind of is the behavioral approach manipulative, and I think, it's very true that as a tool, as long as you kind of understand how the human brain works, you can use it for different ends. And I think it goes back to the point Alice was mentioning around what are the goals that we want to work with, and then is the tool kind of appropriate for it. But I think, and there's a few projects that we could talk about that are exactly on that, trying to train people to just decipher what is manipulative, what is kind of fake information or information that they should be wary of, what is kind of a reliable, credible messenger, what is even fraudulent or trying to take advantage of them, is definitely something that we work on. And I actually think a behavioral approach is critical in, because you need to understand all the different shortcuts and all the different ways that your brain might fall prey to manipulative techniques in order to be able to help people kind of empower themselves to take them on. So I don't know if it's worth talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think those actually are the type of project that we like, is the one where we help people to not get, so there's actually, if you're interested, there's a term for this, is called dark pattern, is when you actually use those kind of techniques, but to encourage people to do something for commercial ends, or to do something that's kind of counter their own interests. And very quickly, like we're working on two projects. One is to help people not get fooled by online fraud, and to teach them like these are the techniques that they use. And the second is to also help people out when they see those new cookies that you see on all the websites are very annoying, and that you can sense that sometimes they get you to accept it when maybe that's not your preferences. So these are two of the things that we're working on, and I think just a more general point, that I think that's also where the field is going. I think the field is going towards less, nudge per se, just nudging, but like thinking about how you enable people to make the better decision. And that's sometimes it's like very meta, it's like telling them about nudge, but sometimes it goes through different other ways.
And again, leveraging kind of what we know about how to disseminate that information, how to make it accessible and so on, so that we can kind of enable people to make better decisions. So, is it going to be about writing a poster? Probably not, because we're going to be thinking about the different ways in which information can be made more easier to understand, more attractive, and so on. And so kind of the fraud example that you were giving is a really interesting one, where we've really thought carefully about how the human brain works, so that we could actually do more than communicate to people about the risk of misinformation, but confront them to it, have them kind of fall or not, and see whether they fall prey to a real world example, to kind of make it more tangible for them and kind of empower them to make better decisions in the future. Did you want to add on that?
No.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the next question.
Behavior approach can support decision makers in terms of prediction of tourist behavior on destination. I'm not sure I understand this.
Probably I can add, I can help to rephrase this, because
Sorry, can you say that again?
I think the question from Carla, she copy pasted a question from the Q&A. The person, I think he was asking if we can then assume or confirm that behavior approach can support decision makers in terms of predicting tourist behaviors in a destination. So I think it was a question in this sense. Please, Roberto Martini, don't hesitate to rephrase it if I've misinterpreted.
Yeah. So if I understand the question like this, I think no, but it can be in combination. So I think what can support prediction of tourist behavior on destination is data. And again, that kind of emphasis on like empirical research and knowing what's going on the ground. Now, with the data and the combination of behavior sciences, that's when you start to be able to do interesting things. So if you can kind of know from the data, like where the people go, that's where maybe you can identify, okay, this is my project will then be about redirecting all these people that go from this place to this other place. But you kind of need the data before you can make the project. And the behavior approach isn't, I would say, like, I personally don't really believe in predictive sciences. And any science that tell you how it can predict the future, you have to be wary of it. So definitely won't tell you where people go, but based on that information, maybe it can help in kind of like, okay, now how do we answer to that? And how do we maybe try to shape the behaviors or the flux to kind of change the pattern that we see. And then where data will be useful again is in that evaluation phase of seeing, okay, now we're seeing with the data that this has shifted or the patterns are now different.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, is that kind of the next question around, which is Philippe Meunier's question around taking decisions on a new destination, assuming that's kind of a tourist making a decision about where to go, is that right? And how do they handle information which be partial or misleading? Not very clear question for me, but
yeah, I'm not sure how maybe that Philippe, maybe you can clarify, or I don't know if in this feature people can speak, or is it all?
I will see if I can make him, yes, able. I've just enabled Monsieur Meunier to speak.
Sorry, that's really putting you on the spot, Philippe.
Oh,
it's our director, so well. But
you hear me?
yes.
Yeah.
No, the question is quite simple, is that when you are tourist and far away from a place where you may go, you need to have good information. And the information you get, including from, for example, media or coverage, is not always up to a point and could be misleading. So that seems to me to be one of the first difficulty, first challenge you face when you want to go to a place which you don't know.
Yeah.
Actually, so you cannot correct yourself let's say the amplification of news which are given. That's a bit the basis of my question.
Okay, so is the question, what can behavioral science do for that?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think what we like to do is always start with breaking down a kind of complex journey, let's say, in different steps that we can approach maybe better. So in that case, maybe like, just to give an example, we would probably like break down the tourist journey into different steps. So like before leaving, the kind of information, I'm like, who do I talk to? What site do I visit? Like, where do I get my information? On site, then where do I update my information, or do I stay? Who do I talk to, etc., etc. And so it's hard to say exactly what can be done in this instance, but there's basically options to like either before someone is going for a destination, like change kind of the way information is displayed so that the information you want to communicate is communicated to the tourist. So this is more like principle of good communication, but that can have a behavior angle to it, and that could be interesting to see, like, why is this person seeing misleading information, and what's the mechanism, and what are the different points of contact or other channels that we can use to have more information come to them. And then you have the option of also on site, what are all the things you can do. And as Claire was showing you, there's a lot of different contributions of behavioral sense. It can be, again, in the kind of communication and how it's delivered and by whom, etc. But it can also be more like environmental changes example, where you have signals and signalétique signs and basically the environment has changed for you to also maybe get different types of information. So I don't know if it totally answers your question, but it shows you maybe different types of examples of things we can look at. But of course, we'll need to deconstruct the question first and understand why we see that pattern.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think it's a really good question and a really good example of how behavioral science and insights kind of fit within a broader framework of other tools. And so kind of misinformation, misleading information and so on is something that we're really looking at, as Elise was saying, with a couple of examples she gave on projects. But it's also a space where there is so much to do that isn't down to kind of just information provision or the way we provide information and so on. It's a space in which, there's a ton of conversation in public space at the minute around regulating kind of the quality of information that's, online. What role do kind of social media platforms have and so on in making sure that information that is given on there is reliable, that it's credible, that it's accurate. And so thinking about, and that goes back to what Alice was saying, kind of deconstructing the journey, if we focus on that kind of initial stage that Philippe was mentioning of before I go on my trip and before I even contemplate, where I'm going, understanding at that point, what are the steps, what happens, what sources of information do people turn to, what actors are significant in that space, what is the quality of the information that they get, where do they hear the information, who from, and so on. And kind of unpacking all of that is going to be a necessary condition to understand if there's a behavioral answer to it, and it's something around kind of information provision and all that, or if there is a space for kind of those other tools in the policymaking kit that Alice touched on, including kind of regulation, incentives, and things like that. So really kind of a good example to also resituate behavioral insights as kind of one of the tools in that toolkit to make a more enabling environment for people to make better decisions in.
Thank you.
So we have a question on quel est le nom du site qui donne des conseils en nudge marketing? I don't know of any sites that do. I don't know if that was Isabelle, if you're referencing, sorry, our conversation on the frameworks, East or Mindspace, because those are not websites, but those are reports that we've made, and I can share if that's of interest, the East and the Mindspace reports. In a way, it kind of also gives some directions, at least of like impactful behavior interventions, but I don't know of any kind of other sites. Pas de problème.
Pas de problème. Are there kind of any other questions for us?
Otherwise, we have 5 minutes, so maybe we can use that time to wrap up if there are no other questions.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for the challenging questions on kind of what we do in our work. Alice and I do love to nerd out on those topics, so thanks for giving us the opportunity. And in the same vein, we want to give you the opportunity to also nerd out on the topic and find out more on kind of the discipline, looking at kind of a few references of books that we think you might find interesting here. So I'll just leave them up for a second, and in case anyone wants references. We can always give them later. And so if there are no kind of other questions or things I wanted to see, just to say thank you very, very much to everyone for attending the webinar. To please log into the next one on the 17th of November, which will be a deeper dive into applying behavioral insights to tourism, led by our colleagues at Behaviour Smart, who will be telling us about kind of how do we go about applying all of those insights that we kind of more theoretically looked at today to the field of tourism specifically. And to give you the opportunity to register already, as Julia mentioned, you have all the details here. And to also keep in mind that this is a series of webinars, as we mentioned, and all the questions we got today around methodology, how do we go about applying kind of those theoretical insights that we have to kind of practical problems. Well, good news, there's a whole webinar about it, and that's going to be sometime in January where Alice and I will be telling you more about that. Okay, are there a few questions?
All right. Julia, do you want to add something before we?
Yes, I'm multitasking here, right? Writing and speaking. So I just I'm putting the link again to subscribe to the next webinar, where indeed our colleagues from Behaviour Smart, Milena Nikolova, and her colleagues will dive deeper into the challenges of the tourism sector with more examples related to tourism. So you are since now more than welcome to join us, and really please share broadly this invitation. It is a fully funded cycle of webinars. It means that you don't pay anything, because it's co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program, which I also seize the opportunity to thank again for this funding. And so I think this is a great opportunity to access to this knowledge from these two organizations. So really do not hesitate to share the next webinar invitation. And also the replay is going to be, of course, at the disposal of you yourselves, but also shared on our channels. My colleague Carla has been sharing on the chat the links to the LinkedIn, Twitter channels. Also, for the community of practice, we are going to activate very shortly a LinkedIn group. So you're more than welcome to join this group on LinkedIn. And that's pretty much it for the moment. So I really hope to see you all on the 17th of November. And I thank you again so much for your time today. So I think that we can wrap up.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks a lot, of course, to Claire and Alice.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.